Good afternoon, ma'am.
Okay, we'll begin today's class with block 4. The paper is BEGE 106. Block 4, we were discussing the Victorian poets. The major Victorian poets that we have dealt with were Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning. These were the two poets that we discussed. We discussed a few important poems written by Robert Browning and Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now we are into another major critic, poet, essayist of the Victorian times, who is Matthew Arnold. He is better known as a critic than a poet. I told you yesterday itself. We are into his poems today, and we have already just looked at the Victorian dilemma. What kind of a dilemma the Victorians had to face? They were torn between science and religion. When I say they were torn between science and religion, what does it mean? The people during the Victorian period, they were in a dilemma whether to believe what science has to say or what religion has to say. So they were in a kind of a confusion, whom to believe or what to believe. See, this dilemma can also be seen in all the poets who wrote during the time, during the Victorian time. See, and in Matthew Arnold, when we are talking about Matthew Arnold, we have two poems here for discussion. The first is the Strayed Reveller, and the second is the Scholar Gypsy. See, when we look at the first poem, it's actually of little importance as far as your syllabus is concerned. So I'll quickly move on to the Scholar Gypsy, which is a very important poem as far as English literature is concerned, as far as the contribution of Matthew Arnold is concerned. So we have this poem in your textbook in page number, it's page number 51. It begins in page number 48, page number 48. See, and what is this Scholar Gypsy about? The very name, the Scholar Gypsy. When you listen to this name, you should have this the notion that it's about a scholar who actually left Oxford and who went with the gypsies. See, he was a student at Oxford, a scholar at Oxford, and he left the academic life. He abandoned his academic life to join a band of gypsies. He was not interested in the academic life at Oxford. He was more interested in the life that the gypsies led. And that is why he quickly moved on to the places where he could find gypsies. And those places were in the pastorals. So this is one of the pastoral elegies in English, you can say. Pastoral elegy means, see, elegy, as I told you, it is nothing but a poem written in order to mourn the death of someone, the loss of someone. Pastoral elegy has a setting of a pasture where sheep are reared, grasslands where sheep are reared, shepherds are found. So such a place full of greenery, a place full of sheep, a place where shepherds work day and night. So such a place. See, when a setting is placed like this, in order to write an elegy, we call such an elegy as a pastoral elegy, and all the characters or all the personalities talked about in the poem, they are all mentioned as shepherds. So here you have this scholar gypsy who has abandoned the academic life, and he is moving on to join the band of gypsies. He feels that he has more to learn from the gypsies, and he is in search of that knowledge, the secret knowledge that the gypsies possess, all the black magic, such things that the gypsies they possess. So this is actually the story of the scholar gypsy actually comes from the book known as Glanvill's book. See, Glanville wrote a book which is actually titled The Vanity of Dogmatizing. The Vanity of Dogmatizing, in which you will find a poor scholar who left the university, who reacted against the scholasticism in the university, and he left because he was a poor man. He left the. Am I not audible? It's raining out here. That is why maybe.
No problems, teacher. Here it is very clear. Audio is
Okay.
clear.
Okay. Thank you, sister. So we were looking at the scholar Gypsy, and I told you this name or this story of the scholar Gypsy comes from Glanville's book, which is titled The Vanity of Dogmatizing. The Vanity of Dogmatizing actually talks about a scholar who was poor, a poverty-stricken scholar who did not like the methodology at the university. He reacted against the scholasticism and he left the Oxford University. So similarly, you have this character, this scholar in Matthew Arnold's poem who is leaving the university and he is heading for joining the gypsies, the band of gypsies, in order to learn what they know, in order to learn whatever skills and see black magic, all those things that they know. And once he learns them, he had plans to spread it throughout the world. See, here in this poem, Matthew Arnold talks about this scholar, his ways, the way he roams about in search of the gypsies, the way he reaches them, the way he talks to them, and many things that he learns from them. See, all these gypsies, they are shown as shepherds because this is a pastoral elegy. And then what happens is, see, actually, the poet then digresses or changes his subject by stating that, see, the scholar gypsy is someone, the scholar is someone who will not face an end. People say that he might have died, he suddenly disappeared. But people say that he might have died. But Arnold here is sure about his scholar, saying that he will never disappear because he is not a normal man. He cannot die like a normal man because he has renounced life. He has, actually renounced all the comforts of life and he is leading a life of suffering. He went to the gypsies, he took all the troubles in order to attain knowledge, and such a man cannot die of a normal death. So we see the poet believing that the scholar gypsy is still around even after 200 years. He is still alive in the premises of the grasslands, pastures, and he believes that this man who led a very simple life, who left all the comforts, the academic career, everything he left in order to seek knowledge. And so this man cannot have a normal death, he cannot have a normal end to his life. So this is what the poet likes to believe. See, it's page number 48 or 54. We are discussing Matthew Arnold's poem, The Scholar Gypsy. So the poem is set in a rural scene. You have shepherds around. You are talking of gypsies who are actually shepherds in this pastoral elegy. And we are talking about the gypsy who left the Oxford University and who reached a band of gypsies in order to learn some kind of magics and secrets from them. And because he left all his comforts, because he left all the luxuries of life, all that academic career could promise him, and he led a very simple life, the poet is having a tendency to believe that he will never have a normal death. He is always alive among the shepherds. So there were people who say that they saw glimpses of this shepherd, this man in the grasslands. So the poet also wishes to keep such a belief alive. He doesn't want to believe that the scholar gypsy might have died after his disappearance. So he wants this to be kept alive, this scholar gypsy's memories to be kept alive. So, though he is sad about the disappearance of the scholar gypsy, and that is why this becomes an elegy, a song of mourning. ഒരു വിലാപകാവ്യമായി മാറുന്നുണ്ട് എങ്കിലും ഇവിടെയും there is a optimism, a kind of an optimism in the poet's mind that the scholar gypsy is still alive and he is found in the premises of the pastures. So this is the poem The Scholar Gypsy by Matthew Arnold. So I told you the storyline of it, how the scholar gypsy, whatever happened to him, how he left the Oxford University, how he went into the pastures in order to search for the band of gypsies. He joined them, he learned several things from them. And his ultimate plan was to spread whatever he has learned from the gypsies, their knowledge to the world. But that eventually does not happen because one day he is found missing. But even though he is found missing, the poet does not acknowledge his death. He does not say that the scholar has died. He wants to believe that the scholar is still alive. And there were people who were actually claiming that they had seen such a man, a scholar, in the pastures, in the grasslands. So this is how the poem ends, with an optimistic hope that the scholar gypsy is still alive. So now into another Victorian poet, Gerald Manley Hopkins. Page number is 56, unit 19. We have two poems from Gerald Manley Hopkins. See, about this poet, if you want to know, you first need to know two things. His two devices or two different devices that he has introduced into English poetry. One is the sprung rhythm and another is inscape. These two things you need to know before knowing Gerald Manley Hopkins as a poet. What is meant by sprung rhythm and what is meant by inscape? See, sprung rhythm is the kind of rhythm that we use in a normal conversation, in a normal speech, wherein you have one stressed syllable which is followed by any number of unstressed syllable and then the stressed syllable is repeated. See, you have it, a discussion on sprung rhythm in page number 60. See, sprung rhythm is opposed specifically to running or common rhythm, such as iambic meter. It is not like iambic meter. I told you iambic meter has an unstressed and a stressed. That kind of a pattern can be seen in an iambic meter. But here what happens is a stressed is followed by several unstressed syllables, but then the stressed syllable is repeated at regular intervals. So this is the rhythm that we use in our normal conversation. So it's a rhythm that we use in our normal conversation. That is why it is called the sprung rhythm. So this is one of the terms coined by Hopkins to denote a complex system of metrics. And this is normally used by us in our common speech. See, in our common speech, this kind of a rhythm is used. See, we never use iambic pentameter or we never use trochee or spondaic that we learned at the beginning of this paper, BEGE 106. I told you during the lessons on prosody, I told you about all these different feet. But here, this is something similar to a common speech, the rhythm that we have in a common speech. So that is, Hopkins is one of the terms coined by Gerald Manley Hopkins. See, another term is inscape. Inscape is another term. And what is meant by inscape? Inscape is nothing but the unique quality which makes an object what it is. ഒരു വസ്തുവിനെ ആ വസ്തുവാക്കി തീർക്കുന്ന ആ വസ്തുവിന്റെ ആ യുണീക്ക് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ക്വാളിറ്റി എന്താണോ അതാണ് അതിന്റെ ഇൻസ്കേപ്പ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ദാറ്റ് സിംഗിൾ തിങ് ഓർ സിംഗിൾ ക്വാളിറ്റി വിച്ച് മേക്സ് എ തിങ് വാട്ട് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ്, that quality, that essence is known as the inscape. The thisness, see, it is also known as the thisness. See, individual quality that makes a particular thing what it is. See, and when we recognize this inscape in other things, it is termed as the instress, our capability to, someone's capability to understand thisness is known as instress. ഒരാളുടെ കഴിവ് ഈ ഒരു thisnessനെ അല്ലെ ആ ഒരു യുണീക്ക് ക്വാളിറ്റിയെ ഐഡന്റിഫൈ ചെയ്യാനുള്ള ഒരാളുടെ വ്യക്തിയുടെ കഴിവിനെയാണ് ഇൻസ്ട്രസ് എന്ന് വിളിക്കുന്നത്. See, and then we have 2 poems from Gerald Manley Hopkins here. Both these poems are important. One is a short one, another is a sonnet actually. One is Pied Beauty. See, Gerald Manley Hopkins was actually a priest, and that is why in most of his poems he shows his dedication, he shows his glorification of God as such, of the creator as such. So one of the poems in which he glorifies, actually both these poems glorify God and his creativities. See, and then we have Pied Beauty, the poem Pied Beauty here, in which he looks at various aspects of nature and finds that all these, dappled beauties, all these dappled, spotted beauties, multicolored beauties, how they beautify the earth and nature. See, contrasting colors അവിടെ കൂടെ ഇല്ല, വള്ളിയും പുള്ളിയും ഒക്കെ ഇല്ല, വ്യത്യസ്തമായ കളർ കോമ്പിനേഷൻ വള്ളികളും പുള്ളികളൊക്കെ ഇല്ല ഈ ജീവജാലങ്ങള്. See, starting from a bird, maybe from a sky which is blue and which is having white clouds on it, a cow which is white in color and has black patches on it, a fish which is red and has pink scales on it. All these different contrasting colors put together. See, when these things are found in nature, how they create a kind of beauty by actually praising, appreciating the beauty of nature. He is actually appreciating God's creativity. So with the painter's eye, he first looked at all the objects and creatures in nature to find out the dappled beauty or the spotted beauty, multicolored spots found on animals and fish and birds. Even the sky is not spared. So all these things, the beauty of all these dappled things show or make one realize the sense of creativity that the creator has. So eventually he is not praising nature, but eventually he is praising God, the creator himself. So it's a praise to God, the creator, the Lord, the creator. So the poem starts with the very line, glory be to God for dappled things. So it's glorifying, the poem glorifies God. So remember these things, the spotted things, the multicolored spots that you find in different animals and birds and all the creatures. So he is looking at observing all these animals and creatures in the world, in the natural world, and he is praising them. But what he actually is doing is he is praising the creator himself, Lord himself, for creating all such beautiful things. See, and then we have another poem which is about a falcon. Falcon is a bird. See, the poem is titled The Winged Hover. It's Winged Hover, which was written in May 1877. the same year when Pied Beauty was published. Sorry, when it was written, Pied Beauty and Windhover, they were written in 1877 but published only in 1918. So this poem has the subtitle To Christ Our Lord. So remember these two poems. The first poem has, see, glory be to, the first sentence of the first poem, Pied Beauty, was glory be to God for dappled things. And this poem has the subtitle, the second poem, The Windhover, has the subtitle To Christ Our Lord. So again, he wishes to call the attention of the readers to the greater splendor of God. See, through this magnificent flight of a particular bird when it is catching its prey, ഇപ്പൊ ഒരു പക്ഷി, ഒരു എന്താ പറയാ, ഒരുപാട് ഉയരങ്ങളിൽ പറക്കാൻ കഴിവുള്ള ഒരു പക്ഷി, ആ പക്ഷി കുറേ നേരം അതിനെ ഇരയെ തേടുന്ന സമയത്ത് കുറേ നേരം അതിനെ ആകാശത്ത് തങ്ങി നിൽക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി സാധിക്കുന്നു. അതിന്റെ ആ ഒരു കഴിവിനെയാണ് ഇവിടെ കവി പ്രശംസിക്കുന്നത്. സോ ദ ഫാൽക്കൺ ഈസ് എ ബേർഡ് വിച്ച് ക്യാൻ സ്റ്റേ ഇൻ ദ എയർ ഫോർ എ ലോങ് ടൈം വെൻ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ആഫ്റ്റർ ഇറ്റ്സ് പ്രേ. സോ ദിസ് see this beauty of its flight, this beauty of this bird, its flight, its movement, everything is praised by Hopkins in the poem Windhover. So the first thing that he says is, I caught this morning morning's minion. So he's calling the falcon a darling of the morning, and he says, I caught this morning. That means I saw this morning. The first thing that he saw in the morning was this bird, the beautiful flight of this bird, which was after its prey. So the kind of beauty that it has, the valor that this bird has, everything is mentioned in the poem. See, the poet also at one moment, he also calls him a chivalrous, see, a creature. My chevalier, he says, oh my chevalier. And that is why he is calling this bird an adventurous, chivalrous person. So through the praising of this bird's flight, he is actually trying to praise the innate quality that God has assigned to this bird. ഈ പക്ഷിക്ക് ദൈവം നൽകിയ ആ ഒരു കഴിവിനെയാണ് ശരിക്കും കവി പ്രശംസിക്കുന്നത്. ആ പക്ഷിയെ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആ പക്ഷിയുടെ ആ ഒരു എന്താ പറയാ, ഫ്ലൈറ്റിന്റെ ഭംഗിയെ അല്ല, പറക്കലിന്റെ ആ ഒരു ഭംഗിയെ അല്ല ശരിക്കും പ്രൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഈസ് പ്രൈസിങ് ആക്ച്വലി God, the creator, who has provided with such beautiful method of flying to this particular bird. So it is there in this poem, and we have to keep some more things in mind about Gerald Manley Hopkins, apart from the words like inscape, in stress, and sprung rhythm. We have to keep some more things about Gerald Manley Hopkins in mind, which are they are that he uses synesthetic images, that is visual, auditory, and tactile images which we can see, which we can hear, and which we seem to touch. അപ്പൊ നമുക്ക് തൊടാവുന്ന, നമുക്ക് കാണാവുന്ന, കേൾക്കാവുന്ന രീതിയിലുള്ള ഇമേജസ് ഒക്കെയാണ് ഇദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ കവിതകളിൽ ഉണ്ടാവുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. He uses archaic words. He uses archaic words, and his poems contain several compound words as such. Compound words means words which individually have different meanings, but when they come together, they give a totally different meaning to the two words which have been combined. See, dapple dawn is one of the compound words in this poem. There are several compound words in this poem. Gold vermilion. So hyphenated compound words are there. There are compound words which have not been hyphenated. All these words are found in this poem. So he is a master in the usage of compound words and also archaic expressions. So remember, Gerald Manley Hopkins as someone who is a very important Victorian poet. See, and I told you this is a Petrarchan, it's a sonnet I told you, but it is a sonnet in the Petrarchan style, a Petrarchian sonnet. We've already discussed what Petrarchian sonnet is and what is the rhyme scheme of a Petrarchian sonnet. So please keep those things in mind when you read this. Now we are into two other poets during the Victorian century, Victorian era, who are Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence. Again, these two people, they are better known as novelists. So many novels they have written. Thomas Hardy is known as the a very pessimistic novelist. He is known as a novelist who writes about a particular region. Wessex regional novelist is also known as. And D.H. Lawrence, he also has written several novels. But all these, apart from all these novels, some of the poems that they have written, they are of importance. And such poems are given here as part of your syllabus. So you have two poems from Thomas Hardy and one from D.H. Lawrence. The first poem is To an Unborn Pauper Child. To an Unborn Pauper Child is the name of the first poem. And what does, see, the poet has to say to a child who is to be born into a life of poverty. See, somebody who is about to be born in a life of poverty, pauper child. So even before the child has taken birth, the poet wants to convey very negative things to the child, to the infant. What does he want to say? To the unborn child, what does he want to say? He wants to say that, see, if you can, please sleep an eternal sleep, go into an eternal sleep. That means you should not breathe. See, he bids the pauper child in his mother's womb not to breathe. ശ്വാസം കഴിക്കരുത്, പറ്റുമെങ്കിൽ പുറത്തു വരരുത്. See, just go to sleep eternally. അവിടെ തന്നെ കടന്നങ്ങ് eternal sleepിലേക്ക്, അല്ലാതെ മരണത്തിന് കീഴടങ്ങിക്കോ എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. Because he doesn't want the child to experience the pains, the troubles and tribulations of the modern life. So he doesn't want the child to come out and face all the troubles that his family members, his mother is facing. That is why he wants the child to die then and there inside the womb. ഒരു ജനിക്കാതെ അല്ല, ജനിക്കുന്നതിന് മുമ്പില്ല ഒരു കുഞ്ഞിനോടാണ് പറയുന്നത്, അൺബോൺ ചൈൽഡിനോടാണ് ഈ ജീവിതത്തിന്റെ വിഷമതകളെ കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ നെഗറ്റീവ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള എല്ലാ ആശയങ്ങളും കൺവേ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. He doesn't want the child to be a plaything for fate. വിധിയുടെ ഒരു കളിപ്പാട്ടമായി ഈ ഒരു കുഞ്ഞ് മാറരുത് എന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ എന്താണ് പറയുന്നത് ഇങ്ങനെയാണ്, you should not breathe. See, while you are in your mother's womb, do not breathe. But see, just seize your breath and you should die silently. You should not come out of your mother's womb. You should not take birth. So this is how the poet begins the poem. But towards the end of the poem, he realizes that nobody can take fate into one's hand. ആർക്കും വിധിയെ തടയാൻ സാധിക്കത്തില്ല, വിധിയെ നമുക്ക് ആർക്കും കൺട്രോൾ ചെയ്യാൻ സാധിക്കത്തില്ല എന്ന് മനസ്സിലാക്കിയ കവി പിന്നീട് എന്താണ് പറയുന്നത്? See, he wants, he knows that the child will definitely see the world. It will come out of the mother's womb. So that is why he says, see, he is full of prayers for the child, and he says, see, he dreams of for this child that it attains all the joys that it needs to enjoy. അപ്പൊ ജീവിതത്തിൽ എല്ലാ സുഖവും സന്തോഷവും ഈ കുട്ടി അനുഭവിക്കട്ടെ എന്ന് കുട്ടിക്ക് വേണ്ടി പ്രാർത്ഥിച്ചുകൊണ്ടാണ് കവിത അവസാനിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. See, there is no man who can take fate into their hands. So that is why the child also will be born. The child will have to dwell on the earth, and that is why he becomes optimistic and he starts praying for the child once it is born. He wishes that the baby gets a good life, a good health. He gets all the possibilities. He gets the opportunity to fulfill his dreams and gets all joys in life. This is what the poet, he knows this is what he alone can do. He cannot do anything to control fate. He cannot take fate into his hands. അപ്പൊ ഫെയ്റ്റിനെ, വിധിയെ സ്വന്തം കൈകളിലേക്ക് എടുത്തു വിധിയെ മാറ്റിമറിക്കാനൊന്നും കവിക്ക് ആവൂല എന്ന് കവിക്ക് കൃത്യമായിട്ട് അറിയാവുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് കവി എന്താണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്? ദ നെക്സ്റ്റ് ബെസ്റ്റ് തിങ് ദാറ്റ് ഹി ക്യാൻ ഡു ഈസ് ഹി ക്യാൻ പ്രേ ഫോർ ദ ചൈൽഡ് വിച്ച് ഇസ് അബൌട്ട് ടു ബി ബോൺ ടു എ പുവർ ഫാമിലി. So this poem is actually addressing an unborn child who is about to be born to a poor family. So the very first lines are shocking, but towards the end, the poet realizes that the only way he can save the child is through his prayers. He wants the child to have love, good health, and everything. And he wants the child to live happily. So this is what the poet says in this particular poem. Then you have another poem which is Great Things. Just as the name suggests, see, he talks about 3 great things in life which he believes are great. So very personal, great things. See, these are not things that we, all of us will find great, but the poet here finds these three things which are great in nature. The first thing is the sweet cedar. The second is dance. And the third is love. Cedar is a drink taken from apple. See? A drink taken from apple. See, love and dance are the other 2 things which he regards as great things. See? Why does he regard these things as great? That we want to analyze. See, cedar is a drink that, see, satiates our thirst. It is sweet and it is pleasurable. That is why he finds it great. See, in the company of a beautiful lady, when he has cedar with him, he finds it pleasurable. So it is something which is sweet, at the same time provides him with pleasure. That is why he calls it a great thing. Then you have dance. See, when we are in an atmosphere of happiness, in an atmosphere of romance, dance is something which, see, enlightens us, something which creates the ambience, which actually gives us very pleasurable moments. ഒരുപാട് നല്ല നിമിഷങ്ങൾ നൽകുന്ന ഒരുപാട് സെലിബ്രേഷൻസിൽ നമ്മൾ കാത്തു സൂക്ഷിക്കുന്ന ഒന്നാണ് ഡാൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. So it is something which will help us create a very joyful ambience. So dance, that is why dance is considered as a great thing by Thomas Hardy. So 2 things. The first is the cedar, the drink which comes out of apple. Another is, see, dance, which always renders happiness to whoever takes part in it. And the third is love. See, love is beautiful. See, in moments of darkness, see, when you have a very lovely partner with you, love is something which is quite beautiful and romantic. So love is also considered as the great thing. So for the poet, these 3 things are the great things. These are the 3 things that he finds great. See, love is beautiful for its romantic moments and for its secretive nature. So all these 3 things, the poet personally finds them to be great and he celebrates them. See, this is all there in this particular poem, Great Things by Thomas Hardy. So we have discussed poems from Matthew Arnold, from Hopkins, and then we have also discussed 2 poems by Thomas Hardy. Now into the last poet in the 4th block, which is who is D.H. Lawrence. The last poet in the 4th block, discussed in the 4th block, is D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence's poem is titled Bavarian Gentians. Bavarian gentians. It's actually, gentians is actually a flower which is blue in color. Blue tubular flower. Blue flower like a tube. And it is a typical personal symbol for the poet. And what does he see? It symbolizes, it has personal implications for the poet. For him, it is a symbol of the complex life. See, what the poet finds is the Victorian era, the age in which he lives, is quite dark. And this flower, the blue flower here, stands for the darkness of the era of the year. And at the same time, it is, see, tubular in shape. So it also acts as a torch, a blue torch, which will lead him to a life of death, actually, which will lead him to death, actually. So a light which will take him to death, which is the eternal silence or the eternal sleep. So the poem was written, he was sick. So the poem is about death and the eternal life after death. So poem is about death, the darkness, the secretiveness, the darkness associated with death, and also about the life after death. So this Bavarian gentians, the rare flower which is found only in the rocky terrains, this flower is not found everywhere, but this flower is a symbol for death and darkness for the poet, but at the same time it is also like a torch which is leading him, showing him the way towards death. അപ്പോൾ മരണത്തിലേക്കുള്ള വഴി ചൂണ്ടിക്കാണിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ടോർച്ചായിട്ടും കൂടി ഈ ഒരു പൂവ് കവിയെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ടോർച്ചായിട്ടും കൂടി ആക്ട് ചെയ്യാണ്. See, because after death one is freed of all the sufferings, troubles in life. So there is eternal peace after death. So that kind of an eternal, see, silence, eternal sleep, the poet is actually yearning for, and that is why he finds it, that the flower as a torch which is leading him to this death, which is nothing but an eternal sleep. See, it's also here there are the poem mentions many of the Greek and Roman mythological figures. See, by mentioning all these mythological figures, he is actually attributing the symbol of death and darkness to the flowers. He mentions Zeus, he mentions Pluto, he mentions the daughter of Zeus, which is Persephone. So all these mythological figures are mentioned in order to suggest the symbol of death and darkness. See, and he says that this flower is acting as a torch which will lead him from this dark world, a world which is quite hopeless, a world which is full of troubles and tribulations. From this world he would be led to a world of eternal sleep by this torch of the Bavarian gentians. So this flower will act, this blue flower will act as a torch. It will lead him to escape from the sufferings and troubles of life. So this is what the poem Bavarian Gentians is about. See, there are a lot of things to be said about each and every poem that I am discussing. So please keep that in mind. You have to, while you listen to the audio, you have to go through each and every detail of the poem that is given in your textbook. So I'm simply going through the poem and just summarizing them or giving the important points about them. You have to work on your own in order to understand the poem, all the poems better. So now into block 5, which is titled The High Modernist, Postmodernist and Recent Poets. And the first poet mentioned in this particular block is William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats. His first poem, there are 3 poems of William Butler Yeats mentioned here, W.B. Yeats. The first is To a Shade, the second is No Second Troy, and the third is the Second Coming. To a Shade is actually about Charles Stuart Parnell, who was an Irish nationalist. See, Yeats was also a nationalist. He was greatly influenced by this revolutionary leader, Charles Stuart Parnell. And he is full of praise for this man. And To a Shade is actually to the spirit of Parnell. ഒരു നിഴലിനോട് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഇവിടെ ഒരു ഷെയ്ഡിനോട് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എന്താണ്? ഷെയ്ഡ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് പാർണൽ, who is coming back to his native place after death. To the spirit of Parnell, the poet is speaking, and he says how the people of Dublin, they have shown ingratitude towards Parnell. They have no regards for the sufferings he had underwent in order to bring freedom for the Irish subjects or the Irish people. So they are not having any regard for his revolutionary thoughts and actions. So even after he is dead, people do not remember him with any amount of gratitude. അപ്പോൾ ഒരു രീതിയിൽ നന്ദി പ്രകടിപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ടല്ല ജനങ്ങള് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ ഓർക്കുന്നത്. പാർണൽ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന റെവല്യൂഷണറി ലീഡറിനെ നന്ദിയോടെ എല്ലാ ജനങ്ങൾ ഓർക്കുന്നത് എന്നൊക്കെ പോയറ്റ് സങ്കല്പിക്കുകയാണ്. പാർണലിന്റെ ആത്മാവുമായിട്ട് സംഭാഷണം നടത്തുന്നതായിട്ടും അതുപോലെ ജനങ്ങൾ കാണിക്കുന്ന ഈ ഒരു നന്ദികേടിനെ കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ അദ്ദേഹം അവരോട് സൂചിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഈ ഒരു ലീഡറിന്റെ സ്പിരിറ്റിനോടാണ് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ഹി വാണ്ട്സ് ടു കംപ്ലെയിൻ ഓർ ഹി വാണ്ട്സ് ടു tell the spirit of Parnell that all these people, they are showing ingratitude towards him. So they never had any regard for the great sacrifice and the service that he had shown to Ireland. അയർലൻഡിനോട് അദ്ദേഹം കാണിച്ച ത്യാഗമനോഭാവവും അതുപോലെ സേവനവും അതിനോടൊന്നും തന്നെ ജനങ്ങൾക്ക് അയാളോട് യാതൊരു രീതിയിലുള്ള റെസ്പെക്റ്റോ യാതൊരു രീതിയിലുള്ള നന്ദിയോ ഇല്ലാന്ന് സൂചിപ്പിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് കവി ഈ ഒരു ആത്മാവിനോട്, പാർണൽ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന റെവല്യൂഷണറി ലീഡറിന്റെ ആത്മാവിനോട് സംസാരിക്കുന്നതായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കവിതയാണ് ടു എ ഷെയ്ഡ് എന്നുള്ളത്. See the first line you can remember if you want. If you have revisited the town, thin shade, whether to look upon your monument or happier thoughted when the day is spent. This is how the poem goes. See, if you have revisited the town, so if after death you revisit your own native place, what are the things that you are going to find? So you are going to find these people who are having no sense of loyalty or respect for you. So all these things he is telling the spirit of the leader, revolutionary leader, Parnell. So the poem is about that. It's a very small poem, only 3 stanzas. And then No Second Troy. What is this poem about? It's about his infatuation for Maud Gonne, a very beautiful figure, another Irish nationalist, Irish national freedom സ്ട്രഗിളിന്റെ സമയത്ത് അതിനു വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് സജ്ജമായി വർക്ക് ചെയ്ത മറ്റൊരു പേഴ്സണാലിറ്റിയാണ് മോഡ് ഗോൺ എന്ന വ്യക്തിത്വം. ഒരു സ്ത്രീയാണ്, ഒരു സുന്ദരിയായ ഒരു സ്ത്രീയാണ്. അപ്പൊ ഈ സ്ത്രീയോടുള്ള അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ സ്നേഹം, അതിനെയാണ് ഈ ഒരു കവിതയിലൂടെ വ്യക്തമാക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. സബ്ജക്ട് ഓഫ് ദ പോയം ഇസ് ഹിസ് അൺറിക്വിറ്റഡ് ലവ് ഫോർ ദ പോയറ്റ് for Maud Gonne. The Maud Gonne actually did not, though she regarded him as a friend, she did not love him, and she married another man. So he is talking about this unrequited love that he had for Maud Gonne. So in No Second Troy, see, Troy, the name suggests Helen of Troy. See, for whom the Trojan War was fought. See, ട്രോജൻ യുദ്ധം നടന്നത് തന്നെ ഹെലൻ ഓഫ് ട്രോയ്ക്ക് വേണ്ടിയിട്ടാണ്. അപ്പൊ ഹെലൻ ഓഫ് ട്രോയ് അത്രയധികം മനോഹരിയായ, അത്രയധികം സുന്ദരിയായ ഒരു യുവതിയായിരുന്നു. അപ്പം see, what the poet wants to convey here is that his beloved Maud Gonne is no second Troy. That means, see, she is almost equated with Helen of Troy. See, he is invoking a comparison of Maud Gonne with Helen of Troy. See, she was the most beautiful, Helen of Troy was the most beautiful and controversial woman of the classical world, Greece. And she was the reason for which Trojan War was fought. See, and what the poet wishes to suggest is that his beloved is also equally beautiful as Helen of Troy. So he is praising his beloved. See, through rhetorical questions, there are several questions asked. See, though the beloved did not accept his love, though she did not marry him, even though he loved her, the poet is still full of praise for this beautiful lady Maud Gonne. And what are the statements that he makes? The poem is full of questions. See, why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery? So why should I blame her for the misery that she has caused her? That is one question that he is asking. Another question is, what could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as fire? So why has she actually given up my love and married another person named MacBride? So he is having jealousy for MacBride. He is not happy that this lady has married MacBride, but he doesn't want to blame her. He just has praises for her. And that is why he is comparing her to Helen of Troy. And from there comes the name of the poem, No Second Troy. So now we have another poem, the third one from W.B. Yeats in your syllabus, which is The Second Coming. Just as the name suggests, the second coming is the second coming of Christ. The second coming of Christ, his return to the earth as prophesied in the Gospels. See, the second coming of Christ is being mentioned here. See, the poet finds that the world is full of confusion, the world is full of suffering, troubles, and he wants a savior to save the world. And he believes that there necessarily will be a second coming. A second coming of the savior has to be there in order to save the world from all the violence, all the troubles and sufferings. So the poem is about that. See, while everyone is waiting for the second coming, what happens is people see a strange figure moving towards Bethlehem. And which is this strange figure? The strange figure is the Antichrist figure with a lion's body and a human head. See, it was spotted in a desert scene. See, the world which has been given to violence, a world which is full of violence, where people are all suffering, people are all leading troublesome life. In this world, a savior is needed. When everyone is waiting eagerly for the savior to arrive, what people witness is an antichrist figure, a lion-bodied and human-headed figure, which was spotted in a desert scene. See, and then poet comes to a realization that, see, in this kind of a world, it is not Christ who could save them, but this kind of a figure. Only this kind of a creature with a lion's body and a human's head is capable of saving human civilization. So this is what the poem is about. See, fed up of all the violence, the massive destruction, everyone is waiting for the second coming of Christ, a savior. And what they witness is this second coming of an antichrist figure, which is having a lion's body and a human's head. And then he realizes that, see, this kind of a figure is the apt one, or this kind of a creature is the apt one to save the world, which is in the path of destruction. See, the modern civilization which has ruined itself, which is full of violence. Only this kind of a figure, an antichrist figure, can lead the world, can save the world. This is the message that W.B. Yeats wants to convey. So what the Gospels say about the second coming of Christ, that has been used here in this poem, and he has put it in a different way. He has brought up the figure of an antichrist in order to show that only such a figure or such a creature will be able to save the world from destruction. This is what he wishes to say. So, the second coming by W.B. Yeats. Now into the next poet of the modern period, actually a voice, a representative of the modern era, T.S. Eliot, better known as a critic, a playwright, but one of his major contributions to English literature being a poem which is The Waste Land. You might have heard it several times. The Waste Land is T.S. Eliot's major contribution to English literature, apart from many of the plays and the essays that he has written. He has also written plays. See, here the poems that are mentioned in your syllabus are The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Gerontion. These are the two poems prescribed for you. The first one, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is about a man who is unable to take decisions, a man who always makes up his mind to do things, but then he eventually digresses from his aim. ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരു കാര്യം ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട്, അത് സ്വന്തം കാമുകിയെ പ്രപ്പോസ് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട്, കാമുകിയുമായിട്ട് സംലപിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് സമയം കണ്ടെത്താനുള്ള ശ്രമത്തിലാണുള്ളത്. പക്ഷെ ആൾക്കെന്താണ്, അതിനുള്ള ധൈര്യമില്ല. എപ്പോഴും I'll do it എന്ന് പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. let me do that എന്നുള്ള ഒരുപാട് ആത്മവിശ്വാസത്തോടെ അങ്ങനെയുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. എങ്കിലും at the last instance, what happens is he quickly backs out. Let us go, then you and I. This is what the poem begins with. It has an epitaph from Dante's Inferno. The first 6 lines are actually from Dante's Inferno. And then we have, it is in Italian. And then we have the poem beginning with let us go, then you and I. The poem is there in page 36, block 5. It's a long poem, but it's only about this man's indecisiveness, the person who is not able to decide, who is not able to take up a decision. See, throughout the poem, he is shown to have several opportunities in order to have a conversation with his beloved, but he is not able to make up his mind. He is not able to take a decision. All his psyche is brought in through the poem, his psyche, his thought process, while he is in an attempt to speak to his beloved. He is an old man, and in his attempt to speak to his beloved, he has several chances, he gets several opportunities, but see, though he is very adamant, though he is very much compelled to speak to her, he is not able to. So his indecisiveness is the whole subject matter of the poem. See, all his thought process has been brought out through the poem. How he is unable to, though the setting of the poem is actually a tea party. And it is an ideal place for someone to express his love for the beloved, but he is not able to. So he aims to talk to his beloved, but he is not able to. He is having all sorts of digressions from his aim. That is what the poem is about. It's a dramatic monologue. There is a silent listener, and the speaker is actually pouring out his thoughts one after the other. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ റോബർട്ട് ബ്രൗണിംഗ് പഠിക്കുന്ന സമയത്താണ് നമ്മൾ ഡ്രമാറ്റിക് മോണോലോഗ്സിനെ കുറിച്ച് പറഞ്ഞത്. In a very dramatic way, the speaker is pouring out his heart to the readers. He is pouring his heart out to the listener, to the silent listener. In a dramatic monologue, you will have the presence of a silent listener to whom the speaker is bringing out his thoughts, his mind, whatever is there in his mind. So here this man is also pouring out his mind to his beloved, who is the silent listener, but he is not able to come to the right words to say. He is indecisive in order to communicate his love to his beloved. And then you have the next one, which is Gerontion. It's again a dramatic monologue, which is about the First World War. There is an elderly man who is named Gerontion. Gerontion, the word in Greek means a little old man. So Gerontion is the main character in this poem, who is talking about the ill effects of war, the First World War, how he as an old man, how he perceives the World War, what are the drawbacks of the World War according to an old man. See, all that he has the psychological dilemma of unable to make efforts towards change for betterment. So he wants to change the world, he wants to bring changes to the world after the World War, but he is not able to because he is old enough. And he is actually talking about the futility of one's existence because he is unable to bring about changes in the world after the World War. He feels that his life is futile. All that he is living for is something futile. അപ്പോൾ ജീവിതത്തിൽ ഒരു ലക്ഷ്യമില്ല, ലക്ഷ്യബോധമില്ല, ജീവിതം വ്യർത്ഥമാണ് എന്നുള്ളൊരു തോന്നലിലേക്ക് അയാളെ എത്തിക്കുന്ന ആ ചിന്താഗതിയാണ് ഈ കവിതയിലൂടെ നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. Gerontion എന്നത് a little old man എന്നാണ്, ഒരു ഗ്രീക്ക് വേർഡ് ആണ്, which means a little old man. He talks about the futility of our existence and the struggle for existence. He talks about how the world has become hopeless, how it is full of destruction because of the world wars. So he represents someone, he looks at the whole poem is actually the old man's view of the world wars, the First World War especially. Remember that Gerontion is a character in the poem, and it is through his eyes we are seeing the after effects of the world war. യുദ്ധത്തിന് ശേഷമുള്ള ജനജീവിതത്തെ കുറിച്ച് ഇദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ മനസ്സിലുള്ള ആൻസൈറ്റീസ്, ഇദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ മനസ്സിലുള്ള വ്യാകുലതകളും കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെയാണ് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. ഹി വാണ്ട്സ് ടു ബ്രിങ് ചേഞ്ചസ് ടു ദ വേൾഡ്, ബട്ട് ഹി ഈസ് അൺഏബിൾ ടു ബിക്കോസ് ഹി ഈസ് ഓൾഡ്, ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ ഹി ഈസ് ഫൈൻഡിങ് ദാറ്റ് ലൈഫ് ഈസ് സംതിങ് ഫ്യൂട്ടൈൽ. സോ ലൈഫ് ഈസ് നോട്ട് സംതിങ് വർത്ത് ലിവിങ്. ആ ഒരു തോന്നലിലേക്ക് ഗെറോൺഷൻ എത്തിച്ചേരുന്നിടത്താണ് കവിത എൻഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. So that is this particular poem. So now into the next poem, which is Philip Larkin, the next poet, who is Philip Larkin, and his two very important poems are Church Going and Whitsun Weddings. Both these poems are almost always prescribed in all the universities for the poetry paper. Church Going and Whitsun Weddings. See, just as the name suggests, church going is about the act of going to a church. It's about the act of going to a church. It's not about religion. It's just about the act of going to a church. Why do people go to church is the question that the poet first of all asks. See, why actually do people go to church? Why is there a need to go to the church? This is what the poet essentially is asking. See, it is one of the most read and anthologized poems of Larkin. And he is actually telling us about see, after people have lost their religious faith, what will happen to the buildings, the huge buildings which stand as churches. See, it's a monologue which discusses the futility as well as utility of the act of going to the church. Why do people go to church? See, first he says that actually, see, why people go to church? What is his first explanation? See, half mockingly and half seriously, the poet says that people go to church in order to wonder, looking at the equipments in the church. ചർച്ചിലെ ഒരുപാട് വസ്തുക്കൾ, ചർച്ചിന്റെ അകത്ത് കാണുന്ന ഒരുപാട് വസ്തുക്കളെയൊക്കെ നിരീക്ഷിക്കാനും കാണാനും കൗതുകത്തോടെ കാണാനും ഒക്കെയാണ് ആൾക്കാർ പള്ളിയിൽ പോകുന്നത് എന്നാണ് ആദ്യത്തെ കണ്ടെത്തൽ കവിയുടെ. See, he finds that church and its equipments are things that people always like to look at. That is why people go there. See, then he says, see, what will happen if people stop going there? What will happen to churches if people lose their faith and they turn against God, or they turn against the habit of visiting churches every Sunday or every other day? What will happen to the churches? He is discussing that next. See, when churches fall into disuse, what will happen? See, when churches fall into disuse, see, all the premises around the church will be full of grass, weeds, and people will be afraid to visit the places because they are full of grass and weeds. But then he suddenly finds out that they would be good places. Churches will be good places to be turned into museums where articles like plate, pics, parchments, all these things can be preserved. See, they can be turned into museums. This is what he finds as something useful about the buildings which are now, see, acting as churches where people go and worship. So all his wonderings about the use and disuse of churches is actually the subject matter of the whole poem. But soon he realizes that, see, a church is a serious house on this serious earth. Very important line from the poem. It comes somewhere towards the last stanza. The first line of the last stanza says, a church is a serious house on serious earth. See, why do we say so? Because, see, it is when we realize, it is when we reach the premises of the church that we realize that, see, we have several serious things to encounter, several serious things to be thought about. We don't just have to live on. Our actions do matter only when we think of the many people who are lying dead in the cemeteries, in the premises of the church. See, all the graveyards. They remind us that all the people who are lying in the graves, in the graveyards, all these people, they had also aimed high. They were also very ambitious people, but they have come, their end is, see, they have all ended up reaching the graveyard. So the place where we have a self-realization that even though, see, whatever way we act in life, whatever we, see, commit in life, whatever things we commit to in life, the ultimate destination is the soil or the earth. So according to our deeds, we will either reach hell or heaven. So this is a place, the church is found to be a place where, see, such thoughts come to our mind. Looking at the graves in the graveyards, we have to realize whether our actions are for the welfare or the destruction of the people around. So that kind of a narration is there in this poem. So while he talks about the building, the outer premises of the church, the building of the church in the earlier stanzas, slowly he comes to the solemn atmosphere, the peaceful atmosphere inside and outside the church. And then he talks about the church as a place where very serious, see, discussions are made. See, in the silent atmosphere of the church, in the sanctity of the church, people realize, see, what they are up to and what they should do. See, how their actions must be. Because, see, ultimately where we reach is the grave. So a kind of a self-realization, a kind of a self-introspection is done in the premises of the church. So a very serious place. It is called a very serious place on this serious earth. So remember, church going is about the act of going to a church. The poet is, see, wondering about, he is pondering over the act of going to a church. Why should people go to church? Or why do people go to church? The first he says they might be going to the church in order to look at the various equipments that are there inside the church. Then he says that, see, what will happen eventually when people stop going to the churches? He realizes that they may be turned into excellent museums. And then suddenly he realizes that it is a serious place on a serious earth where people actually realize, they start thinking about their actions, whether they are doing good to the society or not, because eventually they will be led to the graves. So a very serious place where serious thoughts come to our mind. So that is what churches are meant for. That is what the poet takes us to. This is the thing that the poet takes us to, the thoughts that the poet takes us to. Now we have Wheatson Wedding. Now we have Wheatson Wedding by the same poet, Philip Larkin. See, Wheatson Wedding is one of the longest poems by Philip Larkin. See, most of the time we see all the poems by Philip Larkin, very small ones, but this is one of the longest poems by the poet. And what is the poem about? See, the poem is about weddings. See, Wheatson is the day when marriage taxes are not levied upon people. The day when marriage taxes are not levied upon people. അപ്പോൾ ആൾക്കാർക്ക് മേലെ മാരേജ് ടാക്സ് ഏർപ്പെടുത്താത്ത ദിവസമാണ് വീറ്റ്സൺ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വൈറ്റ് സൺഡേ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. വീറ്റ്സൺ എന്നുള്ളത് വൈറ്റ് സൺഡേയുടെ ഷോർട്ട് ഫോം ആണ്. ഓൺ ദിസ് ഡേ ഇൻ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട് പീപ്പിൾ ഡു നോട്ട് ലെവി മാരേജ് ടാക്സസ് on poor people. That is why on this particular day, several marriages take place. Especially people who are not able to afford to pay the taxes. Most of them marry on this particular, see, White Sunday or Whitsun. See, and the poet here is actually traveling. And while he is traveling in a train, at each and every station, he finds a newly married couple boarding the train, and there is a host of relatives and friends along with the newly married couple. See, at first he wonders about why people marry. Why do people actually marry? What is there in the act of marrying or in the act of marriage? He does not, because he is a single man, he has not married yet. That is why he is not liking the idea of getting married, and that is why he is actually wondering why people are in a hurry to get married, why people get married actually. And slowly he reaches at a conclusion that marriage is something, it's a necessary evil maybe. It is something which is necessary in order to continue the human race. Marriage is something necessary in order to continue the human race, in the sense that it is associated with the act of childbirth, fertility. So it is something which leads to the continuation of the human race. That is why it is, though it is not liked by the poet, he actually finds it a necessary evil. And then slowly he looks at the whole act of marriage from a different angle. And he finds that all the glory that is associated with marriage, it will not stay long. Even though people are enjoying the hours of their marriage, their actual love, their romance will not last long. So this is the cynicism that he has in towards the end of his poem. See, even though the whole act of marriage is celebrated, the actual love and romance, the perfect love, it will not last for long. This is what the poet, this idea is what he conveys towards the end of the poem. So the romance, the love associated with marriage will not be something which lasts long. That is what the poet wishes to say. So during a train journey, he watches several couples boarding the train, and there is a trail of relatives, friends, etc., along with the newly married couple. And he is actually talking to us about the various perspectives that he has about the act of marriage. So first, he is totally against the act of marriage. He does not understand why people actually do marry. Then he realizes that marriage is something which is necessary, even though it has something evil in it, it is necessary because the human race has to continue. And then he talks of how marriage is something which will not have long lasting implications. It is something in which the love, the perfect love and romance which is shown at the beginning of a relationship, it will not last long. So with this cynicism, he ends the poem. See, the title is Whitsun Weddings. Why Whitsun Weddings? Because, see, on White Sunday in England, people do not, see, the government does not levy charges for marriage. Marriage charge is not levied upon poor people. That is why White Sunday is important. From the word White Sunday comes Whitsun. See, he was traveling from Hull to London. He was on a leisurely train journey from Hull to London. While he was traveling, see, at each and every station, he saw newly married couples boarding the train. And this leads him to ponder over the whole act of marriage. So all the things that I told you about, all his thoughts on marriage that come to him one by one, everything is mentioned in the poem. See, and then we have another major poet, Ted Hughes, modern poet Ted Hughes. He is most often known for his animal imagery. Many of his poems are written on animals. All his poems, most of his poems have animals as the main character or the main focus. See, for example, the poems given here, you have 3 poems from Ted Hughes. It's there in block 5, page 77. Ted Hughes's poems are The Thought Fox, Hawk Roosting, and How to Paint a Water Lily. The first poem, The Thought Fox, is actually about the act of writing a poem. See, just as a fox in the darkness of the night, a fox crosses a field. See, only a glimpse of the fox can be had in the darkness when it moves among the crops in the fields. Likewise, a poet who is in a state of trance, who is actually sitting, brooding over the subject matter to begin his poetry, how to start writing his piece of poetry, a trance state of mind. See, only when he is so much immersed in his act of writing, thoughts come to him, just as the fox enters the farm. So it's actually about the process of writing, and we see how at the beginning of the poem, the page is blank, and towards the end of the poem, the page is filled with words. That is the exact thing that the poet is about to write actually comes to a completion towards the end of the poem, just as the fox enters the farm. The Thought Fox appeared in the collection The Hawk in the Rain. It's a collection of poems by Ted Hughes himself. From that collection, The Thought Fox has been taken. And it's about the secrets of poetic creation. How a poet has to have some kind of an atmosphere in order to, start writing the first word in a blank piece of paper. What kind of an atmosphere and ambience he has to create. Likewise, in the midnight, See, from the forest, when the fox enters the farm, and only a glimpse of it can be seen. Likewise is the creative process of the poet. At once, though he sits for hours and hours pondering over the right subject matter to write the poem, he is not able to reach at the words. Suddenly, there is an outpour of words and the pages filled, the pages printed. See, look at in page number 81, you have the poem. At the last sentence, the page is printed. And the first stanza, the last line says, this blank page where my fingers move. So, at the beginning of the poem, page was blank. The poet was not able to reach at the right kind of words in order to start writing his poem. But towards the end, the page is seen printed. So, sitting, brooding throughout the dark night, the poet is able to reach at the right words, the right subject matter, using which he has to write his poem. So it's all about the act of writing poetry. Each and every idea that comes to the poet, like each and every part of the fox's body that the poet can see through the darkness of the night through his window. So similarly, each and every word that he has in mind is put into the blank paper as a piece of poetry. So remember, it is about the act of writing poetry. The setting of the poem is a room and time is midnight. He is sitting near the window, the open window, and he is having all the equipments in order to start writing a poem ready with him. The page is blank. But in this stillness and darkness of the night, just as the fox enters the farm from the forest, likewise, the thoughts of the poet, which were hidden deep inside him, they come one after the other and the page is printed. That means he gives voice to his thoughts. So just as the fox is visible part by part, each and every word or idea from the poet's mind is filled in the paper. So all his perceptions are made clear, all his thoughts are made clear, and they take the shape of a poem. This is the poem. The poem is about the act of writing poetry. So Ted Hughes' poem, The Thought Fox, we have just discussed. Now into hawk roosting. The word roosting just means resting. Resting just before sleep, simply lying down and thinking. That is what means. See, when a hawk is a bird of prey, a very violent creature. This hawk or this bird of prey, it is very arrogant, it is very violent in its actions. It knows its high position in the food chain, in the ecosystem. That is why it is very arrogant in nature, it is violent. And it knows that, see, every other small creature is actually his prey. And the natural system or the ecosystem has planned everything in a way that it favors him. When a human being harms the animals, it is not a normal case of action, but a hawk hunts its prey, goes after its prey, normal course of action, it is something natural, and whole ecosystem supports it. It is part of the whole food chain, food web. So trying to create this quality or this kind of a hierarchy, which is the highest position of highest position. ഈ പൊസിഷൻ നിൽക്കുന്ന ഹോക്കിനെ പ്രൈസ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് ആണ് കവി കാര്യങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്നത്. It's a dramatic monologue. The speaker is the hawk. ആ ഒരു പക്ഷിയാണ് ഇവിടെ സ്പീക്കർ ആയിട്ട് വരുന്നത്. It's a dramatic monologue. And what does he speak? He is speaking to a silent listener. And what he speaks of the advantage nature has given him. He says, I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed, in action, no falsifying dream between my hooked head and hooked feet on sleep. Perfect kills and eats. He talks about his violent act of going after its prey. Violent act of actually hunting its prey is being mentioned here. See, actually, I'm sitting in the same place. I don't know why you are, maybe there is a range issue in your place. Okay, I'll try to be a bit more louder. I have been talking about the hawk. The hawk, how it hunts its prey and how it feels proud over the advantage that nature has given it. See, in the ecosystem, in the food chain, the hawk holds a higher position. So this higher position, the confidence, the kind of arrogance that it shows is because of this higher position that it has gained in the natural world. He is part of the food chain, and in the food chain, he is placed at a higher position. So it's a monologue, a dramatic monologue in which the hawk is speaking to a silent listener. But one has to keep some certain things in mind. See, even though he has superior physical abilities and it has the capacity to kill at will, the similar is that with the human beings. Human beings have the capability, the capacity, physical abilities to kill other animals. They have the ability to kill at will, but their action is not natural. Their action is not natural. It is actually against the law of nature. പ്രകൃതിയുടെ നിയമത്തിനെതിരെയാണ് ഹ്യൂമൻ ബീങ്സിന്റെ പ്രവർത്തികൾ. ഹ്യൂമൻ ബീങ്സിനെ മറ്റ് ജീവജാലങ്ങൾ കൊല്ലാനില്ല. അവരുടെ ഹിംസാത്മകമായ ചെയ്തികള്, പ്രവർത്തികൾ, അത് പ്രകൃതിയുടെ നിയമത്തിനെതിരെയാണ്. മറിച്ച് ഹോക്ക്, the bird of prey, it is actually acting as per the law of nature, and it is feeling pride over the position that it has gained in the ecosystem. So that is what the poet is actually talking about. He is comparing the hawk's action of hunting its prey to a human being, how human being acting in a similar way, they go against the law of nature, while a hawk is simply doing what is quite natural. So hawk has been given the right to kill at will. He has the capability, the ability to kill other animals. Even though human beings possess similar abilities, they also have the capability to kill at will. What they do is actually against the law of nature. This is what the poet wishes to convey through the poem. So the whole action of the hawk trying to reach its prey is being dramatically shown through the poem. It's a dramatic monologue. The hawk is talking about its action of catching a prey. How its action is beautifully defined. How its action is violent, but it is natural, says the poet. See, brutal killing of another creature is actually natural for a bird of prey, but it is not natural for the human beings. So he is actually talking about how, see, it is wrong for human beings to attack other creatures and animals. See, the last poem by Ted Hughes is not that important. How to Paint a Water Lily is not that important, but it is also talking about an artist's struggle to paint things from nature into a page. ഇപ്പൊ പ്രകൃതിയിലെ രമ്യമായ കാഴ്ചകളെ ഒരു പേപ്പറിലേക്ക് പകർത്തുന്നതിന്റെ വിഷമതകളെ കുറിച്ച് ആ ഒരു ആർട്ടിസ്റ്റിന്റെ സ്ട്രെയിനിനെ കുറിച്ച് ആ ഒരു കഥയിൽ പരാമർശിക്കുന്നത്. So it's not that important when we compare it to the other two poems, which are Hawk Roosting and The Thought Fox. So now we have the last poet in the fifth book, who is Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney's The Death of a Naturalist is given. The Death of a Naturalist, just as the name suggests, it is actually about the process of growing up. See, while as a child we are naturalist in the sense that we are in close communion with nature, we actually have close relationship with the things around us. We appreciate nature. We study nature very carefully. We observe nature carefully. Everything in nature seems to us so beautiful. We are anxious to know more and more about nature when we are children. But as we grow up, this naturalist in us actually dies. A naturalist is a person who studies nature, plants and animals and natural surroundings. But see, as a child, we are naturalists. But as we grow up, what happens is the naturalist tendencies in us, they die. We no more are excited about the various things that we see around us. We no more are anxious about the various sounds, the melodious songs that we hear around us. We even do not have the time to observe things around us. So what we are actually doing is, in the process of growing up, we are actually killing the naturalist inside us. The naturalist inside us is actually dying. So the poem is about that. It is about the first, there are only two stanzas. The first stanza talks about an innocent child's view, his feelings about a frog. See, looking at frogs, what kind of feelings does a child have? And then see what are the changes that comes to him as he grows up. As the child grows up, the innocent naturalist inside him, see, is set back or is dying. That is why he thinks practically. And no more the frog or the frog spawn does not interest him anymore. And that is why he feels that all these things, the frog, the sounds made by the frog, everything is so disturbing, everything is not that pleasing. So this change in attitude towards nature, especially the change in attitude of the child towards the frog here. See, in this case, it is the frog or the frog spawn. See how the change in attitude is perceived, is shown. So as part of growing up, we actually, many things are lost from our life. We lose our innocence. We also, see, change our perspective towards nature. The naturalist inside us, which always wants to observe nature keenly, which always wants to praise every minute change around us. Everything is actually receding. The naturalist is actually dying. So that is why the poem is titled Death of a Naturalist. This process of growing up and the reactions of the child on seeing a frog, they are actually compared. See, now that one has grown up, to him the frog is something which is disgusting. He does not like the frog. He does not appreciate the sound made by the frog. To him, to his grown up ears, the sound made by the frog is something disturbing. So, likewise, the process of growing up has actually killed the naturalist in the boy. So, the way while growing, we actually disassociate ourselves from nature. We actually come away from nature. Our communion with nature is lost. This is what the poet wishes to convey through the poem Death of a Naturalist. Seamus Heaney, another modern poet, postmodern poet actually. So this is the end of block 5. See, I had asked sister to give me another session on this particular paper. I think she will be providing it to me. We have 3 more books to go. We'll be discussing the 6th book just now. I'll see how far I can complete, and then we'll have another session, maybe probably for this particular paper, where we can complete the 7th and the 8th block. See, we have 2 books, 2 blocks assigned to the American poets, part 1 and part 2, book 6 and book 7. See, in the first book, we have poems by Emerson, poems by Whitman, poems by H.W. Longfellow and Emily Dickinson. See, these 4 are the poets discussed in the first book, American Poets, part 1. Actually, 5 poets. Edgar Allan Poe is also discussed. His poem Raven is discussed. So let's take up the first poet in the block 6, who is Ralph Waldo Emerson. 2 poems are prescribed here. The first is The Snowstorm and the second is Hamatraya. Hamatraya and the Snowstorm. See, The Snowstorm is actually a poem about snowstorm actually, the storm which creates several, which is actually creating destruction throughout the world, but the poet looks at it from a different angle. He looks at it from a different angle by saying that it is like an invading army. See, it actually, sways with it. The sledge stops. It also takes with it several other things and it deposits it somewhere else in a different pattern. So the snowstorm is actually regarded as an artist who is at work, who is actually creating different patterns in the landscape. So, while he discusses the destructive power of the snowstorm, at the same time he is praising the snowstorm for creating different patterns on the landscape. The different patterns that we can see towards the end of the snowstorm. When the snowstorm ends and when the sun rises, what are the different patterns that can be seen, the astonishing art that can be witnessed, that can be seen on the appearance of the sun after the snowstorm. The snowstorm in a ശേഷം ഈ സ്നോസ്ടോമിന്റെ സമയത്ത് ഉണ്ടായ ഒരുപാട് ഡിസ്ട്രക്ഷൻ, ഒരുപാടധികം വസ്തുക്കളെ ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് നിന്ന് മറ്റൊരു സ്ഥലത്തേക്ക് ഡിസ്പ്ലേസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടാവാം. അപ്പൊ ആ ഡിസ്പ്ലേസ് ചെയ്യപ്പെട്ട ഒബ്ജക്ട്സ് എല്ലാം ഒരു പ്രത്യേക പാറ്റേണിലായിരിക്കും അവിടെ ചെന്ന് വീണിട്ടുണ്ടാവുക. അപ്പൊ ആ വീണതിന്റെ ആ ഒരു പാറ്റേണിനെയൊക്കെയാണ് കവി ഇവിടെ അനലൈസ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് പറയുന്നത്. ഇറ്റ് ഹാസ് ഡൺ എ വെരി ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ വർക്ക്. The snowstorm is taken to be an artist which has formed a particular pattern on the landscape, and he is appreciating that pattern. The snowstorm has acted as a mason and it has worked. He has acted as an artist and has worked throughout the night, and when the sun appears, one can appreciate the beauty of the art, which is astonishing to the poet. So he is taking the snowstorm as an artist. Though it comes with all the hustles and bustles, with all the sounds, though it suggests violence, the snowstorm, the name suggests violence, the poet has looked at it from a different perspective, looking at it from the creator's point of view, from the view of the snowstorm being a very skillful, talented artist who is busy with astonishing art. And when the sun appears, only then people are able to witness the astonishment created by the snowstorm. So all these things are discussed in the poem, The Snowstorm. Now you have the poem Hamatraya. The poem Hamatraya is actually about, the name is taken from Hindu mythology. There is no character named as Hamatraya in Hindu mythology, but people take it to be Maitreya. Parashar, the teacher, and the disciple Maitreya. It's a conversation between these two people, a student and his teacher. It is actually Earth's song. The earth is lamenting. And what is the earth lamenting for? See, the earth, which actually does not belong to any particular person. There have been many kings who have regarded earth to be their own, who have conquered many lands, who have fought many wars in order to conquer several pieces of earth or several lands. But what had happened to all these kings? The teacher and the disciple are having a conversation over it, and what does he say? See, the teacher tells the disciple that even though many kings have regarded earth as their own, they have established their possession over the earth. They have, commanded earth to be used as if it were their own. What has happened to all these kings, all these rulers, they have died and gone. But the earth still remains. See, there had been many kings who had fought long wars, killed several people in order to conquer lands. ഒരുപാട് ഭൂമി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരുപാട് രാജ്യങ്ങളെ കീഴടക്കാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് ഒരുപാട് യുദ്ധങ്ങൾ ഒക്കെ നടത്തിയ ഒരുപാട് രാജാക്കന്മാരുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അവരുടെ ഇന്നത്തെ അവസ്ഥ എന്താണെന്ന് ചോദിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ they are dead and gone, but the earth still remains. So here the teacher wants his disciple to learn that one must lead a very humble life. See, earth is something permanent. The earth, the stars, the natural world is something which is permanent. See, so one should not try to establish one's hold or control over such things. So one should lead a very humble life. One should not try to possess all these things which are a part of nature. So this is what, it's an eye-opener, a kind of an eye-opener to the disciple. The teacher is actually telling the child, the disciple, how to live, how to lead a very humble life through the earth song, through the song of the earth. So this is what Hamatraya is about. So one should not have ego, because all those people who have had egos, all those who have fought wars in order to conquer lands, what have been their ends, they are now buried inside the earth. So they have all dead and they are gone. So the earth is something which is permanent. So whoever lives on this earth has to lead a very humble life. That is what no one can own earth. No one can have complete control over the earth. One should have a humble life. One should lead a very humble life. That is what the earth song of Hamatraya says. So then we have Walt Whitman. We have Walt Whitman's poem, The Passage to India. Passage to India. You don't have an article A before the title of the poem. A Passage to India nalla parayanathu. Passage to India nalladana. It's a poem by Walt Whitman. See, we have a novel having a similar name, almost similar, confusing name. That is why I'm reminding you, this poem is not having the article A or the in its title. And what is the poem about? The poem is written by Walt Whitman. He is celebrating the different progresses made in terms of technology. He is celebrating 3 feats of technology. One is the building of the Suez Canal, which joined the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. He is also celebrating the Pacific, Union Pacific and Central Pacific transcontinental railways, which have joined, which were joined together during the year 1869. He is also celebrating the achievement of laying of the Atlantic and the Pacific cables in 1866. These 3 major developments in technology are being celebrated in this poem, celebrating these 3 events not for their own sake, because they have the power to strengthen the unity of mankind. So all the world can be brought together through these technological developments. He is happy about it, and he is actually praising it, celebrating it. So unification, a spiritual unification is what he is intending to symbolize through his poem. See how the worlds which are lying, the countries which are lying far apart, how they can be united through such technological developments, and how people can be united spiritually. All these things are discussed in this particular poem, Passage to India. Then we have a very interesting poet, Edgar Allan Poe, who is better known as a short story writer. Many of his short stories are of very mysterious nature, and his short stories are something which we cannot stop reading. Once we start reading them, we cannot stop reading them. Such are his stories, his short stories. So he has also written some poems, and one of the best poems that came from Edgar Allan Poe is described here for you, which is Raven. And remember, the raven has the line, nevermore. The line nevermore comes in this line, in this particular poem. See, this repetition of the word nevermore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Raven is actually a bird. See, somewhat like a crow. And what importance has this bird in the speaker's life that we have to see? See, when the speaker is having a life in alienation, when he has lost the love in his life, he is leading a life of alienation. At that time, when he is mourning this separation from his beloved, he is sitting near a window and he is pondering. At that time, he hears a knock at the window, and when the window is open, he did not see anyone entering. But a raven, a bird, had entered the room. See, whenever he spoke to the raven is answering, nevermore. So whatever he asked the raven, the speaker asked the raven, the answer is nevermore. So he has several questions to the raven. See, whether I will be able to reunite with my beloved, the answer is nevermore. So every time the raven quotes the refrain, nevermore, quotes the raven, nevermore. So this bird is taken to be a bird of ill omen. See, though the poem begins like a fairy tale, once upon a time, once upon a midnight dreary, in a bleak December, it begins in a storytelling mode. The language is quite mysterious. There is an exotic feel created. The setting is a room, a dark room, inside which the poet is sitting all alone. He is brooding over all that he has lost in life. All that he has lost in life, he is brooding over. And still, see, he hears the window being knocked at, and he opens the window and the raven comes in. And every time he is asking trying to solve all the miseries in his life by asking questions to the raven, and the answer he gets is the refrain, quote the raven, nevermore. All the responses of the bird leads to the word nevermore. He wants to forget everything, and the raven says, nevermore, you can never forget things. So will my beloved come back to me? The answer is nevermore. So every time, whenever the poet, out of anxiety, out of his troubled mindset, he is asking questions to the raven, the answer is nevermore. His beloved's name is Lenore. And the poet feels that the raven is actually repeating the name of his beloved Lenore. So it's about his personal grief and how a raven is actually trying to answer all his mysterious questions about life and death. So here, I think we should stop today's class. We are almost, the time is almost 4 o'clock. We are moving on to H.W. Longfellow, maybe probably during the next class. We are left with 2 more